Aurora Vila Real had chosen that restaurant for reasons that had nothing to do with taste. It was a place that understood discretion. Private rooms with soft light that folded away the city, menus that arrived without hurry, staff who moved like choreography. She moved through the marble entry with Leonardo and Raphael at her side, small polo shirts under blazers she had insisted they wear, and felt for once the neatness of the world settle around them. The boys jabbered about a school project. Their voices sounded like anyone's 7-year-olds, but to Aurora they were a music she had learned to read like instructions. Times, meetings, answers to interviews, the order of meals. Today there was a meeting afterward, a call with an investor. Yet she had told herself, and told the empty air where her husband's laugh used to fit, that the two of them would not be rushed. She had brought them here because it was time to prove to herself that presents could be scheduled and kept. Before she could reach the private room she had booked, the hum of the main dining room pressed against her. In the center of that hum sat a small wooden table against the window, the kind people thought belonged to a different life. Scuffed surface, mismatched chairs, the finish worn thin by palms that had held countless hands. At that table, a man with grease-smudged knuckles was sharing a plate with a girl no older than 6. Camilla sat close to him, knees swinging, a small mouth that had just been filled with a savory pastry. He was bent over a napkin, speaking low, his face earnest and open in a way that made him look too large for his simplicity. Aurora's first impression was visual, a contrast like a painting in a gallery reserved for the blunt light of reality. Her silk dress against his faded jacket, her manicured hands against his scarred palms. She hesitated for a breath, watching the girl's laugh and the man's ease with small things. Then she surprised herself. Instead of retreating to the secluded room where she could preserve the illusion of control, she guided Leonardo and Raphael toward that table. Heads turned, subtle ripples of curiosity among the diners who read the city in faces, and a murmur threaded past the host stand. The boys, unversed in social code, waved at Camilla as if recognizing a friend. Camilla waved back, then offered the man another scrap of pastry with the absolute generosity of children. Aurora set her hand on the back of an empty chair, and for the first time in months she felt a quiet rebellion in her chest, an impulse to sit where she was plainly visible, to be imperfect in public, to let the children find something untidy and human in the architecture of her life. If this were a different person, if she were less careful, or less careful that others thought she was careful, she might have rehearsed a line of small philanthropy, an offhand question about the girl's birthday, an offer to pay for the meal, a glance that said, "Look how kind I am." But Aurora had a different, sharper hunger. She wanted to see the man without the varnish of polite distance. She wanted to see whether dignity could be recognized before it was purchased. A server came to their side, a slim woman with quick eyes. Aurora asked, without the tremor of performance, if the table would mind company. The man looked up, startled, as if the world had shifted its axis for a moment. He measured her, then measured the boys, then nodded, with a courtesy that was not servile and not curious in the way of people who fish for stories. "Of course," he said. His voice was steady, the kind of voice you might reserve for explaining a difficult thing to a child. "Sit, there's plenty." The boys slid in like a pair of boats finding harbor. Camilla regarded them with solemn assessment and then, as if concluding they were safe, offered her pastry for inspection. Leonardo took it exactly as a boy would, grinning, daring Raphael to be the same self that was already familiar and fearless. The 3 children leaned into one another as if they had been waiting for the license to do so. Aurora watched them and felt, in the place where grief had softened into habit, something like relief. There was a recognition here that belonged to small hands and sticky fingers. Children did not wait for permission to be full people. "Thank you," the man said to them without assumption that the thanks were owed. He folded a napkin and smoothed it over his knees in a way that made his hands seem less raw. Aurora had chosen her posture carefully, relaxed but deliberate. "I'm Aurora," she said, "because names are anchors and because introductions make kindness possible without spectacle. This is Leonardo and Raphael." "Tiago," he answered, "this is Camilla." He offered his hand and she took it. It was a hand that looked like it had learned its strength from tools, from steady labor, from an economy of words. When she pressed the name, Tiago, into her memory, it fit easily, a shape that could belong in a story she had not expected to inhabit. There was an initial stretch of silence that could have been awkward. Instead, it tasted like something uncorked. Aurora ordered coffee and asked for 3 hot chocolates for the children, the concession of wealth made modest by the intimacy of the request. The boys demanded to know why she had not taken the private room, and she gave them a look that had both mischief and tenderness. She had chosen this table because the world needed to be less curated for children and because she wanted to remember how to be ordinary. Across the table, Tiago watched her, polite but guarded. He answered questions about what he did for work in quick sentences, mechanic, then steadied the conversation on his daughter. "She's very curious," he said, "likes everything with a motor." Camilla chimed in, describing in precise terms the toy cars she was given and the way Tiago fixed them when they broke. She explained, in serious, small words, how the man made the cars hum again. The anecdote had the ring of a ritual. Tiago's pride came not with a boast, but as a soft illumination along the edges of his face. He told of learning to stay when the mother had left, of the many ways being present reshaped time. He did so without complaint, only with a description that read like proof. Aurora listened. In the private room, she had been expert at listening for the right facts, the right figures, the right pauses that indicate profit or risk. Here, surrounded by clatter and the soft argument of the dining room, she found herself listening for something else, the shape of compassion, or the way presence can be its own currency. She noticed little things, the way Tiago paused, unconsciously, before telling his daughter to try the chocolate, as if measuring the social cost and deciding it was worth it, the way his eyes softened at her laughter. Around them, people continued their rituals of curated conversation. A table of lawyers to their right debated loudly in economic metaphors. A couple in the corner exchanged small present tense intimacies. They saw the contrast and registered it the way a weather report registers a sudden storm, an observable event that requires no action. Some glanced with the casual superiority of the comfortable. Others, younger perhaps, watched with the hopeful amusement of those who sense a story beginning. After the plates were cleared, Aurora did something that surprised even herself. She asked Tiago if he had a spare minute to talk outside. It was a question dressed in ease, but she meant it as an exchange. He hesitated, pride and caution braided across his face. "I have to get back," he said. "Works." He left the sentence unfinished, because the vocabulary of single parenthood does not always fit public places. Aurora touched his sleeve lightly, a gesture that carried no patronage. "No questions about money," she said softly, "just a minute, as a mother." That line, made of 2 ordinaries, settled the conversation into a new shape. Tiago exhaled and, after a beat, nodded. They stepped into the humid city air together, and the noise of the restaurant pinched away behind them as if by design. Outside, the street smelled of rain and exhaust. The city pressed around them in a mannered way. The hum of cars, the distant call of a fruit vendor, the soft ding of a tram. Tiago held Camilla's hand. She tugged at a loose thread on Leonardo's jacket, and then wandered toward a lamp-post to study its stickers. Aurora turned to Tiago. She could have asked many things, the sort of skeletal curiosities that rich people imagine as pit stops in a story. Was he sure about the work? Did the mother ever return? Did he have family? But she began with something simple that betrayed her own tender territory. "How do you do it?" she asked. "Every day." Tiago blinked at the word every, as if it weighed more than it should. He looked down at Camilla, who was intent on aligning the lamppost's stickers, then back at Aurora. "You don't stop," he said finally. "You just keep doing. There are the mornings when you don't want to. There are the nights when you worry you did something wrong, but you wake up and the small things are waiting. They need you. So you go. Aurora's mind mapped that answer onto her own days, which were scheduled with assistants and meetings and polite handoffs to nannies. The revelation was not novel. She had known, in theory, the work presence asks, but the truth of it, the tactile insistence in his voice, hit her like a missed heartbeat. "I thought I knew," she confessed, and the admission was more about herself than about him. "But I don't. I think I spent a long time protecting them by protecting the world they would inherit. Maybe I mistook safety for presence." Tiago listened, unjudging. "People protect all sorts of things," he said. "Sometimes it's money. Sometimes it's dignity. Sometimes we think making a better present for them means making their world shine. But they need a person who is boring and boringly there." It was a small ricochet of a sentence, and it landed like a pebble in a pool. Aurora let it ripple. The boys, oblivious to the sudden depth between adults, ran ahead to the bakery 2 blocks down, where, despite the late hour, the lights poured like honey, and the air carried the scent of warm bread. Camilla followed, hand in Tiago's, and the 4 children clustered like small planets around a bright center. That afternoon, Aurora found herself laughing in the bakery at the boys' insistence that a pastry be split exactly 3 ways, exactly right. Tiago watched them with the kind of concentration that people reserve for things they are not willing to break. He moved easily through the simple transactions with the baker, talking price and portion as if these conversations were a language he never left. He refused when Aurora offered to pay, and gently so. "I can pay for my daughter's pastry," he said. "You paying would make it a story. I don't need a story to eat a pastry." Aurora recognized the logic and respected it. She could have insisted and framed the insistence as charity. Instead, she slid into a different role, one less theatrical. She suggested they all sit in the park nearby, that the boys race and the children share their pastries, that the adults talk as parents sometimes did when they were tired and needed each other's sympathy without fanfare. They took the pastries and found a bench under a jacaranda that had survived several city projects and still held its riot of purple in delicate defiance. The park was a bowl of ordinary life. A man walked his dog, a teenager skated clumsily, an old couple argued about the next turn in a novel. Under that tree, the city felt less sharp and more like a town, stitched together by small mercies. Tiago told a story about teaching Camila to tie her shoelaces. Not the kind of tale that begs for sympathy, but one that revealed his steady presence. "She gets frustrated," he said, "and sometimes I pretend my hands are slow so she'll be patient. Works every time." His hands moved as if showing an invisible knot, and Aurora watched the motion like a lesson. There was pride in his voice that had nothing to do with display. Leonardo and Raphael discovered a bug under a leaf and announced it with the kind of solemnity that turned discovery into a public event. Camila leaned in to see, then decided, in the way children do, to rescue the creature from the world of curious hands and place it back in the grass. The boys, delighted by her decision, declared her honorary member of their exploratory club. As the light softened toward evening, Aurora felt something settle in her like dust finding a new surface. She had expected to feel charitable, magnanimous, the deposit of her wealth into a needy life. Instead, she found the transaction was more complicated and a lot more generous. A man's quiet insistence on being present offered her a mirror. She had been shielding her children from stories she did not wish them to carry, stories of loss, of precariousness, only to discover she had also shielded them from the ordinary friction of life that builds character. Tiago, meanwhile, watched Aurora without the interest of a man looking to transform his fate. He observed how she moved around the boys, how she let them lead and then corrected them with an authority softened by play. He noted the way she did not ask for help when the younger one scraped a knee. She simply knelt, took his face in her hands, fixed the tear, and continued. The sight unsettled and comforted him in the same breath. There was a precise competence in her gentleness that was new to him. He had learned to be straightforward, to speak plainly. He had not been prepared for someone so practiced in control to seek the mess of the ordinary. "You're very good with them," he said, when the conversation turned back to practicalities, to the small cares of luggage for school trips and favorite cartoons. Aurora gave a half smile. "I have a very good teacher." She did not name the empty person at her table of memory, but the boy's presence and the rhythm of other parents around them supplied the missing syllables. "I have to learn to be boringly there," she added, thinking of the way Tiago had named the idea earlier. Their conversation deepened with the night. They traded pieces of their lives in economical sentences, places they grew up, the way their mothers had taught them to wash a shirt until it was clean, the small compromises they had each made. Each confession was incremental, not confessional, an architecture of trust built out of small admissions. At some point, Tiago looked at Aurora and said, without prelude, "You don't have to pretend with me." Aurora blinked. "Pretend?" "That you're always in control," he said. "That everything is fixed." He shrugged. "You look like you can fix anything." She laughed then, a brief sound that masked a deeper ache. "Sometimes I can," she admitted. "Sometimes I fix things that don't need fixing, because I'm afraid of what won't be fixed if I'm not the first to try." The confession landed between them, soft and sharp all at once. There was no judgment in Tiago's eyes, only an understanding that bred its own tenderness. They agreed to meet again, not as a charity engagement or a social experiment, but because the boys and children had connected in a way that suggested more than coincidence. Aurora left the park thinking of time in a different register, as something not to be parceled, but to be held. Tiago walked home with Camila in a quiet contentment that tasted like the end of a long shift. Tired, fulfilled, and a little lighter. That night, Aurora sat at her kitchen table once she had put the boys to bed. The apartment smelled faintly of lemon oil from the cleaner she favored, and the city lights threw narrow rectangles of illumination along the floor. She opened a ledger she kept for things lesser people might call journals. She recorded meetings, decisions, and small confessions. She hesitated, then wrote a single line in the margin. "Spend tomorrow afternoon at the park." The handwriting looked small and human. She did not know then whether that small line would change everything or be only an odd, kind act. She did know it made her pulse less frenetic, and that in itself was a victory. Across town, Tiago washed Camila's hair in a basin with the kind of careful patience that belonged to his nightly rituals. Camila hummed a tuneless song she had invented, and Tiago let the water run over her small, trusting head. He thought about Aurora in the way a man thinks about a sound that is new and pleasing. Curious, not yet committed. He felt the old knot of warning he had learned to tie around his heart loosen by a fraction. They were, both of them, at the beginning of a sequence that would demand more than the small, graceful alignments of a park bench and a shared pastry. There would be friction. There would be choices that cut against pride. But for the first time since the lines of grief had been drawn on Aurora's face, she felt the possibility of presence as something that could be chosen, not only scheduled. The city moved on around them, indifferent and generous. A dog barked in the distance, someone laughed in a nearby bar. A tram hissed past like a long breath. In the quiet that followed, both of them folded the small evening into their separate nights, and for the first time in a long while, let themselves imagine mornings in which they would not be alone. The next afternoon, the park carried the same ordinary liturgy. Late summer light slanting through plane trees, a boy's shriek when a ball escaped his foot, the steady, companionable clack of a dog-sitter's book against a bench. Aurora arrived before Tiago, as if attendance had become a part of her schedule. She chose a bench that faced the playground, but gave a line of sight to the path where the tram crossed, small rituals to measure a day. Tiago came with Camila on his hip, her hair still smelling faintly of the soap he favored. He sat down beside Aurora without ceremony, folding his long legs beneath him, the way a man who has carried children many nights does. Between them the boys, her two, his one, and the others who gravitated to any available game, ran their usual circuits. Tentative alliances, quick betrayals, an empire built of gravel and imagination that lasted until the whistle of a distant vendor broke it apart. They spoke in the spare register they had been practicing. Tiago talked about the new schedule at the clinic, how demands had thinned then swollen with the season. Aurora mentioned a parent-teacher meeting next week and the way the class had been humming with projects. They traded small domestic details, like sailors sharing navigation marks. Which fluorescent bulb in the kitchen had finally burned out, the brand of cereal that could be bought in bulk and still be eaten without complaint. Each fact was a thread. Neither of them tried to knot them into something more than they were. At one point, Camilla wandered back to them, cheeks dusted with playground dust, and sat in Aurora's lap, as if she had always belonged there. Aurora's hands remembered the curve of child's shoulders with a competence that surprised her. There was an ease in tending another person's small comfort that did not immediately demand reciprocation. Tiago watched her with the quiet attentiveness of someone learning to recognize new features on a familiar map. "My aunt used to say," he began, "that if you want to know a person's true patience, give them a child whose shoelace keeps untying." He laughed into the sentence, and then, softer, "She wouldn't have lasted an hour with Camilla." Aurora considered correcting him. Her own patience was not some heroic thing, but the words he'd chosen fit the scene better. "Maybe your aunt would be surprised," she said. "Children have a way of showing us what we've been practicing all along, or what we haven't." He looked at her then, and the smallness that had entered their conversations from the start opened into something steadier. "I wanted to ask you something," he said. He blamed it on the way his voice dipped when he asked for favors, but there was also an honesty there that felt earned. "There might be extra hours at the clinic next week. I can ask for them, but—" He paused and scrubbed his hand through his hair. "If I take them, I'd need someone to pick Camilla up from school a few afternoons." Would you be willing to help? Just sometimes." She felt the ledger at the edge of her thought, the tidy column of entries where she recorded commitments, the margin notes where she allowed herself 1 or 2 errands of tenderness. Saying yes had been a reflex before, when she had taught herself to be the first to try. Saying yes now required naming an internal permission. "I can," she said. "If the days are set, tell me which ones and I'll put them in the ledger." Her voice was small with its own diplomacy. She wanted to be useful, but not undone. "It's Tuesday and Thursday," Tiago said, relief making his shoulders drop. "For a month, maybe. I don't know. It's sudden. If it's too much—" He stopped himself. "It's not too much," she said, and surprised herself by adding, "I want to." The addition had neither calculation nor pretense. It was as simple as a choice. There was a kind of agreement in that exchange that did not need speeches. They watched the children again, separate tasks crossed by proximity. Camilla took Aurora's hand and led her to a chalk-strewn patch of ground where the smaller boys had been attempting to create a mural of a rocket. Aurora knelt, and for a moment the world narrowed to colored dust under her nails and the way a child's brow furrows with concentration. She drew a line that the children declared perfectly straight, though it leaned. They announced it as a triumph. She allowed herself to be complicit. When they parted that evening, the bench felt a little warmer where they had sat. Aurora walked home with the small knowledge that her ledger would soon contain entries that were not obligations, but choices aligned with something gentler than efficiency. Tiago took the tram and held the warmth of the afternoon like a small talisman in his coat pocket. The first Tuesday arrived with a sky so clear it looked like a promise. Aurora met Camilla outside the school gate, the child's face bright with the thrill of being collected by someone other than the usual parent. They walked back to Aurora's apartment by way of a bakery, where the proprietor knew Camilla and slipped her a cookie with theatrical secrecy. The boys came to Aurora's place as if it were always meant to be a neutral, provisional camp. A couch that consolidated into a fort, a scattering of crayons, the television left to its own devices. Aurora prepared an easy meal, pasta, something that could be made quickly and eaten without ceremony, while the children debated the correct order of superhero abilities. She moved through the small domestic choreography the way a conductor moves through a score. Hands efficient, eyes on safety, voice calibrated to low decibels. There was a photograph on her kitchen shelf, half hidden behind a stack of recipe cards. A woman in a wind-blown dress, laughing without reservation. Aurora had bought the frame and placed it there because that laughter used to teach her how to open. She did not show it to the children. She did not have to. Tiago called on his way home to say the evening had stretched longer than anticipated. "Don't wait up," he said. "Take whatever time you need. Thank you again." "You're welcome," Aurora said. The words settled into the space between them with an ease that made them both speak less. When he arrived later, the apartment smelled of garlic and lemon. The children were asleep on improvised nests of blankets in the living room, their shoes kicked off in the same small perimeter. Tiago stood in the doorway and watched them as if the sight required translation. Aurora came up behind him and placed a hand on his arm, the contact casual and unremarkable. "How was it?" she asked. "Harder than I thought," he admitted, "but good. She talked about a moon made of cheese and asked me if I remembered when I used to sleep under trucks as a kid." He gave a soft, embarrassed laugh. "I told her I did not sleep under trucks." Aurora smiled. "You should have. It would have made bedtime stories more interesting." He looked at her, looked at the small, steady domestic ease she had provided, and for a moment the city's hum seemed to compress, giving them a fragile clarity. "You did more than I asked," he said. "You asked me to pick her up," she countered. "I made dinner. It's not—" She stopped. Saying "it's not a big deal" felt less true than admitting the ripple it had made inside her, the unbidden warmth of being chosen. He stepped closer, not with any suddenness, but with the quiet courage of someone who had learned to measure his words. "I know," he said, "and I'm grateful." They went into the kitchen. The children slumbered like small, surrendered things. The apartment took on the softened hush of night. Radiator tap-in, a distant bicycle bell, the refrigerator's low thrum. Tiago washed his hands at the sink, and Aurora dried them, the cloth moving between them with the intimacy of a small shared task. "Do you have plans this weekend?" he asked, the question more significant than it seemed. She considered the ledger, the neat lines of commitments, and the spaces she'd begun to leave deliberately blank. "No," she said, "not really." "Would you—" He hesitated, as if the words themselves required scaffolding. "Would you like to come to a barbecue with us? My sister is hosting. It's nothing big. Just people, food. My mother will be there. It'd be good to meet more of the family." Aurora's first thought was the old reflex: assess, schedule, optimize. Her second thought was the ledger's new, softer margin. Her third thought, the one that arrived quietly and without instruction, was a small yes. "I'll come," she said. He exhaled, relieved. He looked down at the sleeping children, and, with a tenderness that had become less restrained in these last days, he said, "Thank you for today." She returned the thanks because it was true. Later, as she sat by her kitchen window with a glass of water, the city lights throwing narrow patterns along the floor, she touched the photograph on the shelf. The woman's laughter seemed, in that small bowed moment, like an old lesson. How to let someone else carry the weight sometimes. How not to equate usefulness with self-worth. Aurora closed the window against the night's chill and wrote a line in her ledger in smaller handwriting than usual. "Say yes because you want to." It was not a proclamation. It was not meant to fix anything. It was simply a fossil of a choice, laid down and waiting to be discovered again. Outside, a tram hissed past. Tiago's steps receded down the stairwell, and for the first time in many months, Aurora let herself think about mornings in which she would not be alone. And then, immediately, she let herself imagine the small risks those mornings would require. There would be days when schedules collided, when pride would bristle. There would be evenings when she had to surrender control and find that the surrender did not mean loss, but a different kind of gain. She folded the ledger closed. The apartment held its ordinary sounds like a promise. In the quiet, the possibility of presence, chosen, imperfect and real, felt less like a plan to be executed and more like a practice to be continued. And somewhere between the modest victory of the ledger and the clatter of the city, both of them began to learn a new grammar of keeping. Simple, regular, and not always done alone. They had not yet spoken of the larger things, of grief measured in years, of debts, of work that might ask for more. Those belonged to another mapping. For now, they had learned how to be present to one another's small needs, and that learning, in itself, held a promise. The following Thursday, there was a message on Aurora's phone from an unknown number, short, formal. It asked her to confirm attendance at a parent workshop the school was offering on conflict resolution. She typed yes before she realized she had done it. Then she looked at the ledger, at the margin note that now read like a map, "Be present." And for the first time, she did not feel the ledger as an armature only for work and order. She felt it as the place where she might remind herself of the person she wanted to be, not merely the person she had to be. The steps toward that person would be small and often awkward. They would involve laughter and missteps and the occasional retreat. But as Aurora switched off the kitchen light and the apartment settled around the sleeping shapes of the children, she no longer felt the edges of the night as sharp. There was a slow, human unfolding somewhere between the ledger and the lack of it, a space where two people, both somewhat brittle and newly repaired in different ways, could imagine mornings in which they were less alone. She turned the key in the lock and sat at the edge of the couch for a long minute, feeling the aftertaste of the day. If asked to name what had shifted, she would have searched for an answer and perhaps offered something diplomatic. It would have been easier, she knew, to measure change in acts, more pickups, more dinners, more shared errands. But the change felt less like a list and more like a small softening of the edges that had kept her safe. On the table lay a child's crayon drawing of a rocket with 3 windows. In the closest window, someone had scribbled a figure and written in the uneven script of a 5-year-old, Aurora. She smiled then, because in the end, that was how small revolutions announced themselves. In the blunt, generous language of a child who knew, without calculation, who had been kind. Outside, the tram faded into the evening. Inside, 2 people rested within a fragile trust that had not yet been named, but was growing, day by day, into a practice. The morning after the workshop arrived with the ordinary hesitations of any new habit. The kettle stuttering to life, a child asking for orange juice before teeth were brushed, the small negotiation of who would take which lunchbox. Aurora moved through it with a steadier calm than she had a month before. The ledger lay open on the counter beside a pen, as if to remind her that attentions could be deliberate without being rigid. She had written 2 new marginal notes overnight in a neat, practiced hand. Practice small kindnesses. Ask for help when tired. Tiago was already at the table when she came in, a mug between his hands, reading a list on his phone with a brow furrowed in the way she was learning to read. He looked up, and for a fraction of a second, the old wariness flickered across his face, an unreadable doubt about whether he should speak or simply let the morning be. Then he set the phone down and handed her the mug. "Leftovers of courage," he said, smiling. "Do you want the last yogurt? I can warm it." She laughed. "I'll take the yogurt, thank you." It was small, and it was enough. They moved through the morning like 2 people learning a dance, not yet fluent, often stepping on each other's toes, but willing to keep the rhythm. Aurora packed the children's bags with a method that felt almost ceremonial, snacks in one pocket, a note for the teacher in another. And Tiago folded a jacket and tucked it into the smaller child's backpack, his fingers finding the elastic loop without fuss. The children kissed foreheads and left, a blur of backpacks and an excited recounting of a playground dream. The workshop that day was held in a bright room at the school, chairs arranged in a soft rectangle as the facilitator wrote, "Conflict equals needs plus strategies" on a flip chart. Parents trickled in with the wary politeness of adults who have learned to protect themselves first and make small offerings later. Aurora sat by the window, ledger closed at her feet like a talisman. When an elderly woman offered her a seat, Aurora hesitated, then chose to shift, an almost imperceptible practice of presence. The woman introduced herself as Isabel and smelled faintly of lemon and jasmine soap. During the first break, they spoke as 2 people who had learned to talk to children in practical verbs. "How do you stop yourself from answering for them?" Isabel asked, straightforward as a teacher. "When they don't know how to say no, you do it for them out of love, and then they never learn." Aurora thought of the photograph on her shelf, of the woman's laughter that had once shown her how to let someone else carry the weight. "I try to let them wobble," she said. "I say less, I listen more, and I tell them it is okay to try and fail." Across the circle, someone coughed, and the facilitator, soft-voiced, patient, invited the group into role play. Practical exercises, she explained, were not tests but rehearsals. Aurora volunteered for a scenario that felt neither theatrical nor trivial, a morning where schedules collided and a child refused to leave the playground. She found herself performing, then pausing again to breathe before giving the other parent a chance to be heard. The exercise ended with an ordinary imperfection, a raised voice, a regretful apology, and then an attempt to repair with an offer of coffee and a commitment to call later. Outside the school, the sky had gone thin and white. Tiago waited on the bench, hands in his pockets. He reached for Aurora's hand as she sat down, and for a moment she felt the honest awkwardness of two adults who were learning to ask for help and to receive it. Her hand in his was not a declaration. It was an experiment in trust. They walked home with the children in tow, the small restitution of shared errands filling the spaces where speeches might have been. It was not all tidy. That afternoon, a letter arrived in Aurora's name, with the official stiffness of a reminder, an account overdue by a figure that made her stomach drop as if she had swallowed cold glass. The envelope felt heavier than it should have. She opened it at the kitchen table, while the children made forts from couch cushions, and the numbers on the page settled into the room like an unwanted guest. Tiago saw the color run from her face, and came to her side without being asked. "Do you want me to look?" he asked. She hesitated, the ledger's quiet insistence at her elbow. To ask for help meant to show the shape of what she couldn't carry alone. She slid the envelope across the table. He read, a slow frown knitting his features, and then surprised her by reaching for his wallet. "We will sort it," he said, with a certainty that was not theatrical but steady. "Let's call them. Maybe there's a plan." She had known, intellectually, that the larger things would require conversations, of grief, of debt, of how work might demand more time. The letter had made one of those conversations urgent. When she had first imagined mornings with someone else, she had not fully envisaged the arithmetic of it. There was tenderness in the realization that intimacy carried not only warmth but obligations. There was also, beneath that tenderness, a modest terror about exposing the bits of her life that still felt raw. The mortgage arrears she had managed alone, the unpaid bills accrued during months when she had prioritized being present to a child's needs over paying a late notice. They called the number together. The voice at the other end was the kind that read payment plans from a script. But when Aurora explained, stumbling around the most vulnerable facts like a traveler around a sleeping animal, the person on the line softened in places where the script allowed it. They offered a revised schedule, a lower figure for a time, and asked only that Aurora confirm by email. When she hung up, she felt both relieved and strangely exposed. The ledger opened before her like a witness. That evening, Tiago made a dinner that was nothing more than pasta and a salad, and it was perfect because of the way he moved around the small kitchen as if he owned all the cabinets and had the right to take up space. They ate at the small table, their conversation practical and then tentative, sliding from the children's illnesses to the issue of weekend schedules. Aurora said what she needed: more predictable nights when she could write the ledgers without being interrupted, a little help with errands on the days when the children's rhythms took all her strength. Tiago listened. He did not offer platitudes, he offered times and tasks. The barter of domestic life had a strange romance to it. The mutual allocation of time, the small promises that in another context would be called vows. Later, when the children were in bed and the apartment held its nocturnal hush, Tiago suggested they talk about the things they had been avoiding for months. "We can't keep skimming along," he said. "I mean, this letter. Your ledger is good, Aurora, but we need a plan for the heavier things." She looked at him. In the dim light, his face was open and tired. She could have recoiled, could have decided that some truths were safer left unspoken. Instead, she wrote in the ledger, the motion almost ritualistic. Talk finances, map responsibilities. Then she closed the book and folded her hands in her lap. "Let's do it tomorrow," she said. "We can make a list and we can be honest about what we can and cannot do." "Tomorrow," he repeated. He hesitated, then asked, "And about grief? I mean, there are days when you hold that alone. Do you want me there for those?" Her throat cramped at the word, the particular gravity of it. In the ledger, she had not written how long the hollow had been inside her, how often she had found herself measuring a day by the smallness of a child's breath in the night. Grief was a cartography with no clear landmarks. It was a thing that might be shared but could not be divided like a cake. She had learned to hide it beneath schedules and lists, to compress it into the margins of necessary acts. "I don't know if I want you to fix it," she said slowly. "I want you to be willing to sit with it when it is heavy, to not be frightened by it. Sometimes I need a hand. Sometimes I just need you to listen." He reached across and curled his fingers around hers. "I can do that," he said. The words were simple and small, and they did not erase anything, but they set a new standard. Presence as a practice, shapes of help that could be named. She found herself thinking of her ledger not as the only structure for her life, but as a portable altar, an offering to be consulted, adjusted, and sometimes burned. The next day, they sat together with the ledger open, and a mug of tea cooling between them like a mediator. They made a list that balanced household needs with the uncanny arithmetic of emotion. The children had priorities, less TV, more outdoors. The bank had priorities, a minimum payment, an appointment with an advisor, and both of them had priorities of pride and caution. They argued a little about whether Tiago could realistically take Wednesdays off to attend school meetings, about whether Aurora could afford, emotionally, to give more time to a job that asked for nights. The quarrel was not vicious. It was an honest collision of wills learning to negotiate territory. At one point, when voices rose slightly, Aurora felt the ledger's margin note vibrate against her thumb. "Say yes because you want to." She breathed, felt the words settle into her like a small garment, and softened. "I trust you," she said, "not as a surrender, but as an invitation. I will try Wednesdays if you can take over the Thursday pickups every other week." "Deal," Tiago said, and his relief at a practical solution was like a passenger leaning back with a satisfied sigh. They wrote a tentative schedule in the ledger, a map of who would be where and when. There was a flinch of shame when they added the financial plan, a line about savings cut in favor of immediate needs, but the act of writing made reality less monstrous. It allowed them to name the size of the beast and set at least a few parameters around its movement. Afternoons began to look different. Tiago picking up at 3:30 with a child who wanted to show him a new drawing, Aurora taking a shorter meeting and leaving earlier to make a midweek dentist appointment. They learned to text one another across the day in small, efficient sentences. "Running 5 minutes late. Can you buy milk? Picked up a roll for dinner." The ledger recorded these changes as if they were small treaties. Sometimes, the messages arrived at moments when one or the other needed evidence that they were not alone. A brief photograph of a child asleep in the back seat, a thumbs-up emoji, a voice note with a quick joke. There were relapses. One night, exhausted from a week of extra hours at the office and the slow attrition of unpaid hours, Aurora snapped when Tiago suggested a solution that would require her to miss a meeting. "I can't just rearrange everything," she said, realizing as the words left her mouth that they were sharper than she intended. Tiago's face closed for an instant, the old reflex of defensiveness. He answered quietly, "I didn't mean to take over, I just thought—" She stopped him and put her hand on his arm. The gesture felt like a small amnesty. "I know," she said. "I'm sorry. I'm tired. Help me figure a plan that doesn't ask you to be my only support." They leaned in toward a compromise, A babysitter one night a week, a shared calendar on the fridge, a promise to tell the other when they felt overwhelmed before the resentment calcified. It was less theatrical than the kind of reconciliations one reads about in novels, but it suited them, a set of small agreements repeated until habit formed. In the months that followed, the ledger accumulated more than schedules. It received confessions written in a private hand. I let silence be a lesson. I chose to ask for help. It archived small mercies. The day Tiago took a child to the doctor and came back with a single red carnation because the child had wanted to bring a flower to Aurora. The time Aurora skipped a meeting to watch the younger one sleep and found, in the quiet of the bedroom, a contentment that felt like recompense. The ledger also held the less pleasant things, a note about a bill that crept higher, an apology that needed to be said to a friend. Evidence that life was not a tidy progression, but a braided line of tries and repairs. Grief remained a presence at the edges. Sometimes it arrived in the simplest moments, in the way a certain song on the radio made Aurora's hands go cold, in the neatness of an empty chair at a school play, in a text from a relative who lived in another city and asked a question about the past. When it came, Tiago learned to notice the way her silence lengthened, to sit with the quiet rather than fill it with reassurances. He would make tea or open the window to let in the smell of rain, and by the small measure of bedside attentions, he became someone who could be trusted with fragile things. Not everything settled. There were days when the ledger's neatness made them both impatient. There were meetings where they presented a united front and came home to find that pride had ribbed them mercilessly against each other. But the net effect of their small experiments in keeping was that the apartment held more laughter and less brittle solitude. The kiln of everyday life refined them, not by burning away faults, but by annealing them into something more resilient. One late October evening, after a week of bad weather and overcrowded pantries and a school fundraiser that had exhausted them both, Aurora found Tiago in the hallway holding a cardboard box full of books. He had rescued them from a colleague who was giving them away and thought they might fit into the shelf above the couch. He looked almost sheepish under the light, a small domestic gesture that was both practical and oddly intimate. "Do you mind if we put them here?" he asked. She looked at the box, then at him, then at the ledger on the table where a new list waited: winter needs, heating check, coat repair. She felt suddenly blessed by the smallness of the life they were making. The boxes, the lists, the unpaid letters, the children with their crayons and rocket drawings, and at the center of it, the practice of saying yes because you wanted to. "No," she said, "I don't mind at all." He smiled like someone who had been given the permission to continue. They carried the box together, elbows brushing, and in the ordinary choreography of lifting and setting down, the fragile trust between them thickened into something that could hold the next small crisis. The ledger closed on the table, not as an armature, but as a map of a life that might always be unfolding, messy and human and true. And in the soft light, with the city murmuring beyond the windows, they began again, in the modest way of people who have learned that keeping someone is an art measured in patience and the willingness to share one's burdens, not to redistribute them, but to make them lighter by count.